History rarely announces its turning points with clarity. More often, they arrive disguised as absurdities. Ideas laughed off, headlines mocked, moments dismissed before their weight is fully understood. In retrospect, these moments reveal themselves not as jokes, but as signals, cracks in the surface, glimpses of a struggle already underway, moving silently beneath public awareness. One such moment surfaced briefly in the summer of 2019. It appeared strange, even comical. Then, it disappeared. But the forces behind it did not. In August 2019, the global news cycle briefly lost its sense of scale. Reports emerged that the President of the United States had directed White House legal advisors to explore whether it was possible, under international law, to purchase Greenland. The reaction was swift and overwhelmingly dismissive. Denmark's Prime Minister called the idea absurd. Political commentators portrayed it as the whimsical impulse of a former real estate developer confusing geopolitics with property acquisition. Social media erupted with jokes, memes, and imagined luxury towers piercing Arctic ice. Within days, the story vanished. Another oddity filed away in an era already overflowing with them. But behind the sealed doors of Washington's security institutions, there was no laughter, no satire, only an uneasy recognition that something uncomfortable had slipped into public view, because the idea itself was neither new nor irrational. It was the visible tip of a far older strategic concern, one that had been accumulating quietly beneath layers of ice, bureaucracy, and denial. Greenland matters not for how it appears on a map, but for what it connects, what it obstructs, and what it conceals. In the modern world, power is no longer defined solely by armies or borders. It is defined by systems, supply chains, choke points, networks, and the invisible infrastructure that keeps advanced societies running. Greenland sits at the intersection of several of the most critical systems on Earth. To understand why Washington would risk diplomatic embarrassment over a frozen island, we must move beyond the familiar language of oil fields and shipping lanes. The real story begins at the atomic scale. The 21st century economy is not built on coal and steel. It is built on precision, on miniaturization, efficiency, and tolerances measured in microns. At the core of this system lies a group of materials rarely mentioned outside technical circles: the rare earth elements. These 17 elements form the hidden framework of modern civilization. They allow smartphones to vibrate, screens to illuminate, motors to spin, satellites to stabilize, and weapons to guide themselves with astonishing accuracy. Without them, electric vehicles become impractical. Wind turbines lose efficiency. Advanced military platforms become technologically hollow. They are not rare because nature withholds them, but because refining them is brutally difficult. Extraction is environmentally destructive, financially expensive, and politically unpopular. For decades, Western economies chose avoidance. The problem was outsourced. As the West shifted toward finance, software, and services, the physical foundations of the digital age consolidated elsewhere. One country accepted the pollution, the industrial burden, and the long-term planning required to dominate this sector. China did not drift into this position. It constructed it deliberately. Through subsidies, environmental tolerance, and massive investment in processing infrastructure, Beijing secured control not just over mining, but over refinement, the true choke point of the supply chain. This distinction is critical. Mining without processing offers little leverage. Processing without alternatives creates dependency. By the late 2000s, China controlled the overwhelming majority of global rare earth processing. The rest of the world relied on Chinese facilities to transform raw material into usable components. That dependency remained largely invisible until it was briefly weaponized. In 2010, amid a maritime dispute with Japan, shipments of rare earth materials were reportedly restricted. Within weeks, Japanese manufacturers faced production disruptions. The embargo was temporary, but it did not need to last. The message was delivered. Supply chains could be turned into pressure points. Industrial dominance could be exercised without firing a shot. This realization sent shockwaves through American defense planning. Modern military systems no longer resemble those of the 20th century. They depend on compact, high-performance components built around rare earth magnets. Neodymium provides strength. Dysprosium provides heat resistance. Together, they allow motors to operate inside fighter jets, missile guidance systems, radar arrays, and naval propulsion units. Interrupt that supply, and even the most advanced weapons platforms become vulnerable, not to enemy fire, but to material scarcity. This is where Greenland enters the equation. Beneath the ice of southern Greenland lies one of the most significant rare earth deposits ever identified. Near the small town of Narsak, geological formations contain substantial quantities of heavy rare earths, including dysprosium, far rarer and more strategically valuable than lighter elements. For decades, the site was little more than a scientific footnote, remote, inaccessible, politically inconvenient. Climate change altered that equation. As Arctic ice retreated, access improved. As global demand surged, value soared. And as geopolitical tensions hardened, the need for a non-Chinese supply source shifted from desirable to urgent. To American strategists, Greenland began to resemble not a frozen fringe, but a keystone. Yet resources alone do not determine power. Control, governance, and influence matter just as much. The license to develop the deposit was held by a company that appeared Western, but was deeply entangled with Chinese capital. Its largest shareholder was a state-linked Chinese firm aligned with Beijing's industrial strategy. The paradox was alarming. The mine capable of weakening China's dominance risked reinforcing it. If raw ore flowed east for processing, the dependency would persist, merely disguised. Meanwhile, the consequences of this struggle were felt most sharply not in Washington or Beijing, but in Narsak itself. A quiet Arctic town became a geopolitical fault line. For some residents, mining represented economic survival. Greenland relies heavily on financial transfers from Denmark, and resource development is seen by many as the only path toward true independence. Jobs, infrastructure, and self-determination lay on one side of the scale. On the other lay existential fear. The rare earths were chemically bound to uranium-bearing material. Extraction would disturb radioactive waste. Concerns over water contamination, grazing land, and fishing grounds dominated local debate. In a fragile Arctic ecosystem, mistakes are permanent. What began as an industrial proposal evolved into a moral crisis. Prosperity versus preservation. Independence versus survival. That tension exploded into politics during Greenland's 2021 election, which became a referendum on mining itself. A party advocating strict environmental controls and limits on uranium-linked extraction won decisively. One of its first acts was halting the project. For Washington, the immediate risk of a Chinese-controlled mine was removed, but the strategic problem remained unresolved. The minerals stayed underground, the dependency endured, and time continued to move. Because while attention focused on what lay beneath Greenland's surface, another transformation was unfolding above it. The Arctic was opening. Shipping routes once sealed by ice became seasonally navigable. Distances between Asia and Europe contracted. Strategic geography, long frozen in place, began to shift. Greenland, once a barrier, was becoming a gateway. This revived older concerns. During the Cold War, planners understood that the shortest path between Eurasia and North America passed over the pole. Greenland became an early warning platform, hosting radar systems designed to detect incoming missiles. That role never disappeared, it evolved. As weapons grew faster and harder to detect, Arctic-based sensors became even more critical, and the battlefield expanded beyond the sky. Beneath the North Atlantic run fiber optic cables carrying most of the world's internet traffic. Disrupt them and markets freeze, communications collapse, logistics unravel. Greenland sits near key maritime chokepoints guarding these arteries. Strategically, it functions as an unsinkable aircraft carrier in a newly contested domain. By 2019, these layers, resources, supply chains, military positioning, climate transformation, had converged. The idea of purchasing Greenland was not a formal policy proposal. It was a signal, a public leak of private urgency, a glimpse into a competition already underway, and others had noticed. While Washington hesitated, Beijing moved quietly. Not with bases or fleets, but with infrastructure, contracts, and debt. In 2018, China declared itself a near-Arctic state. The term had no legal meaning. Strategically, it meant everything. The Arctic was no longer a frontier, it was a corridor. As ice receded, routes along Russia's northern coast promised to cut travel time between East Asia and Europe by up to 40%. Shorter routes meant lower costs, faster delivery, and leverage over global trade. But shipping lanes require nodes, ports, airports, logistics hubs. Greenland offered all of them. China's entry came as a proposal, not a provocation. A state-owned firm offered to finance and build 3 international airports for roughly $550 million. For China, a minor investment. For Greenland, transformational. On the surface, it was development. Beneath it, influence. Airports control access. They shape logistics. They persist beyond election cycles. Security planners feared not immediate militarization, but gradual dependency. Ownership shifts quietly. Loan terms endure. Access becomes leverage in moments of crisis. It was a familiar pattern, seen before in ports, railways, and telecom networks across the globe. Infrastructure framed as opportunity, dependency revealed later. And in the Arctic, the stakes were only rising. When repayment pressures mounted, leverage followed. From Washington's perspective, Greenland could not be allowed to become another link in that chain. The response was fast and unusually blunt. The United States did not publicly veto the airport project itself. Instead, it applied pressure where it would be decisive. Denmark was informed, in unmistakable terms, that Chinese control over Greenlandic airports was unacceptable. Copenhagen, typically cautious about intervening in Greenland's internal economic affairs, was forced into action. In a rare and revealing move, Denmark stepped forward and offered to finance the airports on its own. This was not generosity, it was containment. Denmark absorbed the financial burden to keep China out. The airports were built without Chinese participation. The immediate risk was diffused. But the episode made something unmistakably clear. Greenland was no longer a quiet matter between Nuuk and Copenhagen. It had become contested terrain in a much larger geopolitical struggle. Russia, meanwhile, was watching closely. For Moscow, the Arctic has always been central to national strategy. Russia holds the longest Arctic coastline on Earth and has spent the past decade reinforcing it. New bases, upgraded airfields, radar installations, and missile systems have steadily appeared along its northern frontier. For Russia, the Arctic is not merely a shipping corridor. It is a defensive shield and a launch axis. The reopening of Arctic waters strengthened Russia's position in some respects, but it also introduced new vulnerabilities. Increased traffic brought increased surveillance. More actors meant more friction. Greenland's proximity to Russia's northern approaches made it an unavoidable factor in any future Arctic confrontation. This convergence turned Greenland into a quiet pressure chamber. American security priorities, Chinese economic strategy, Russian military positioning, and Danish sovereignty all overlapped on a single island. And at the center of this collision stood Greenland's own unresolved political dilemma. Greenland is not formally independent. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, exercising control over most domestic affairs, but lacking authority over foreign policy and defense. Each year, Denmark provides a substantial block grant that funds healthcare, education, and essential services. That support stabilizes Greenland's society, but it also creates dependence. For many Greenlanders, independence is not an abstract slogan. It is a long-standing political aspiration tied to identity, culture, and self-rule. But independence carries a cost. To stand alone, Greenland must replace Danish funding with its own sustainable revenue, and the options are limited. Fishing cannot carry the entire economy. Tourism is seasonal and fragile. Mining, particularly rare earth mining, remains the only path capable of generating revenue at scale. This is Greenland's trap. To gain political freedom, the island must monetize its land. But doing so risks environmental damage, social division, and foreign influence. Every partner brings trade-offs. Western firms offer alignment but often lack processing capacity. Chinese companies bring capital and expertise but raise fears of dependency. The United States offers security guarantees but expects strategic alignment in return. There is no neutral choice. The election that halted the Kvanefjeld project did not resolve this dilemma. It postponed it. The decision reflected genuine environmental concern and local resistance, but it also froze Greenland's economic trajectory. Without mining income, independence remains distant. With mining income, sovereignty becomes complicated. Washington recognized this reality and adjusted its approach. If the most controversial deposit was politically untouchable, attention would shift elsewhere. American planners began examining alternative sites with lower uranium content and fewer environmental risks. At the same time, engagement with Greenlandic authorities deepened, not just on security, but on economics. This was not traditional diplomacy. It was commercial statecraft. The objective was to rebuild a supply chain from end to end: extraction in Greenland, processing in North America, manufacturing within allied economies. An attempt to reconstruct an industrial ecosystem dismantled over decades of outsourcing. But rebuilding that ecosystem is slow and expensive. Rare earth processing demands enormous capital, specialized expertise, and environmental tolerance that Western societies have largely abandoned. This is where time becomes unforgiving. Demand for rare earths is accelerating. Electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, data centers, and advanced weapons platforms all require increasing volumes of these materials. At the same time, geopolitical tension makes disruption more likely, not less. Each year, diversification is delayed. Existing suppliers gain leverage. Greenland offers time, but time is finite. As these pressures mount, Greenland remains suspended between competing futures. One path deepens integration with Denmark and Europe, trading sovereignty for stability. Another opens the door to industrial development and economic independence at the cost of environmental risk and strategic entanglement. A third attempts balance, extracting value while preserving autonomy. History suggests such balancing acts rarely last. Meanwhile, the Arctic continues to transform. Ice retreats further each year. Shipping windows expand. Military planners revise maps once thought immutable. What was a frozen buffer is becoming a dynamic theater, and Greenland is no longer peripheral. It is a hinge. What happens there will shape supply chains, security architectures, and political alignments for decades. The competition remains quiet, incremental, and largely invisible. But its consequences are immense, because the struggle over Greenland is not about land. It is about control of systems modern societies cannot function without. And that struggle is far from over. By the early 2020s, the contest entered a new phase. It was no longer about headlines or symbolic gestures. It was about whether the West could still construct the physical foundations of its own future, or whether that capacity had already been surrendered without full awareness. For decades, globalization rewarded efficiency over resilience. Rare earths were mined, refined, and assembled wherever costs were lowest. Environmental damage was exported. Strategic dependence was ignored. The assumption was simple: markets would function, trade would flow, rivalry would remain contained. Greenland shattered that illusion. The issue was not merely Chinese dominance. It was the time required to build alternatives. Processing facilities take years to develop. Expertise cannot be improvised. Political tolerance for industrial disruption is limited. Western governments found themselves trapped by their own values, seeking independence without accepting the industrial reality it demands. Greenland's deposits offered material, not solutions. Without allied processing capacity, even new mines would feed the same bottleneck. Breaking monopolies is harder than creating them. This forced a quiet recalibration. Rare earths were no longer treated as a niche concern. They were reclassified alongside semiconductors, energy grids, and communications as foundational security assets. Greenland became a test case. Could the West coordinate across governments, industries, and borders? Could it build resilience without provoking backlash, environmental disaster, or escalation? The answers remain unclear. On the ground, however, consequences were immediate. Halting Kvanefjeld protected communities from unacceptable risk, but deepened economic dependence. Independence slipped further into the future. A generational divide emerged. Younger Greenlanders, shaped by global debates on climate and identity, faced impossible choices. Development without safeguards risked irreversible loss. Sovereignty without revenue risked collapse. There was no option without sacrifice. Denmark, too, found itself constrained. Responsible for defense and foreign policy, yet increasingly sidelined by superpower rivalry. Every investment proposal, every airport, every diplomatic visit to Nuuk now carried implications far beyond domestic politics. Washington understood this tension and worked within it. Rather than coercion, it emphasized partnership. Consulates opened. Aid expanded, scientific cooperation deepened, military coordination intensified. No annexation, no ownership. But slowly, the island's strategic gravity shifted. This is modern power, not conquest, but integration. Not flags, but frameworks. At the same time, Arctic militarization continued. Russia expanded its northern fleet. China increased research missions and icebreaker capacity under scientific cover. NATO quietly returned focus to the high north. Greenland's role was subtle but decisive. Control of its airspace and surrounding waters shaped surveillance, response time, and deterrence. In an age where seconds matter, geography regains authority. Yet the most significant shift was psychological. Greenland forced Western policymakers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Liberal economic systems protect adversaries as effectively as allies. China's dominance was built within the rules, not outside them. Russia's posture relied on geography, not provocation. The systems that generate prosperity also constrain strategic action. As demand accelerated, electric vehicles, renewables, advanced weapons, the gap between ambition and capacity widened. Greenland's story became emblematic of a larger transition, from territorial power to system power. In that world, influence flows through supply chains and infrastructure, not borders. Greenland sits directly on that fault line. Whether it becomes a pillar of resilience or a symbol of missed opportunity remains unresolved. What is clear is that the Arctic can no longer be ignored. The quiet struggle beneath the ice is already underway, fought through contracts instead of cannons, infrastructure instead of invasions, minerals instead of missiles. In this world, maps change slowly, until suddenly they don't.